Hi, and welcome to the second to last principle in the Disruptive Leaders Mindset series. Our principle is, as a disruptive leader, I talk precisely. And here are the questions I'd like to answer. What is the problem that talk precisely solves? What can you watch for in terms of behaviors that you will manifest in following this principle? And how does this principle reinforce all the other ones that we've talked about? Before I go there, I just want to talk a little bit about something that you may have observed as you've been going through these principles. And that is that with the exception of the overarching principle of serve users with awesome products, these are all about our conversations, about the quality of those conversations and how it is we communicate. And that's on purpose. There's methods and techniques that are also part of Disruptive Leader in a Box. But these principles are really there to make sure that you are getting the most out of all the conversations you are getting, so that the methods and the techniques that you follow will give you the kind of results we want, which in this case, of course, is developing awesome products. So let's get on to the problems. What are the problems that Talk Precisely solves? And there are two of them. The first one is when there are ill-defined terms. And the second one is when we have conversations and our conclusions and our evidence is vague. So it's about vague conclusions. How does that come about? Let's talk first about ill-defined terms. With all the acronyms that float around out there, it often happens that the people that you are working with, some of them don't understand what it means. And so that creates confusion for people and they can't communicate effectively because they really don't understand what it is that you're talking about or what it is that that particular term means. So that's a fairly simple one. But the other one that's more powerful, or in the negative sense, is the conclusions that we draw. And that goes back to the very first kind of principle underneath serving users with awesome products, which is that we learn as we go. When you learn, you have to come back with conclusions. What did you learn? What's the conclusion that you take from that? And to have conclusions, you need to have evidence or data to support those conclusions. And that is all the way through the process, all the way from the very beginning of the portfolio where you go out to uncover what the problems are with customers that you potentially might want to solve, all the way through the endpoint where you're scaling it up and you're into very detailed A/B testing and things of that nature. Each one of those is going to have conclusions. Each one of those is going to have evidence. And if it's not well defined, if you haven't really put them together appropriately, then in fact, the quality of the conversation suffers and we don't get the most out of it that we could. So what are the behaviors that you will manifest that are going to overcome this problem of vagueness in conclusion and ill-defined terms? Well, the definition of the terms is somewhat of a simple one, especially as it relates to the company acronyms and people coming in who might not understand them. And that is to go and define them for people when they seem to have some confusion. But another one that happens is as a result of the fact that we often use terms or labels for things that have two meanings. So, and a good example of that is people often use the word customer to imply their distribution channel, and other people use customer to define the end user. And you can find yourself in a position where people are having a debate about something, and what you're noticing is in fact that they're using the same label, they're using the same term, but they actually mean something by it. And so the way that you deal with that is you just, point to one person and say, okay, so what do you mean by that label? What do you mean by customer? And what do you mean by customer? And if you find out they're different, then what you've done is you've stopped this conversation that was going on. And in fact, they weren't really debating anything. They were just debating the term underneath of what it is that they were using. So be watchful for that. When you see that, you just question it and pull it out. So that's the kind of the technical aspect of how it is we talk precisely to make sure that we have the right terms in place. The second behavior that you'll start to manifest is when you are reporting something, you'll likely start to make more preparation. So you'll have your evidence for whatever the work is that you've done. you'll draw your conclusions and you'll stop yourself and you'll say, does the evidence actually support this level of conclusions? Can I in fact justify these conclusions based on the evidence I have? And sometimes it's very mixed. And when you actually present it to them, what often happens is you get very precise in it. And you might say something like, well, I did this work, I've come back, I've got 3 conclusions. I feel really good about 2 of them, like number 1 and number 3, because I think the evidence really supports it, but I'm not really sure about conclusion number 2, because I think there might be different interpretations for this evidence. What do you think? So then you have a much better conversation about the evidence that you have that supports that conclusion and whether there's a different interpretation and therefore a different conclusion that we could make as a result of that. That's a very powerful conversation that you have, because now you're getting people really engaged in the data and the methodology that we use, etc., to make sure that the decision you ultimately make from these conclusions is the most valid one. The second behavior that you start to manifest is being on the receiving end of that and challenging the evidence and the relationship between the evidence and the conclusions and different interpretations that go on. So this is, depending on who it is you are in this conversation, you kind of roll back and forth on it. Another behavior that you'll start to display to people is that you will pause before you say something to make sure that the information that you were providing them is extremely clear and there's no possibility of confusion coming out of it. And that's not something that we usually do. Usually we just kind of roll on and answer things. And I talked a little bit about that when I talked about hovering and not already thinking of the answer. So pausing is in fact a very powerful technique that you can use, a behavior that you can use that will make sure that the conversations are really communicating effectively amongst all the parties, so you can extract the collective intelligence from the group. And the last one I want to talk to you about is the most difficult one from a personal standpoint, and that is to admit to confusion or vagueness when you see it in yourself. And I talked a little bit earlier about that in the Speak My Truth principle when I said sometimes there are data or evidence or conclusions or something we're trying to say, we're passionate about it, that feels instinctive and we can't really formulate it correctly. And so you start to speak about it and it doesn't come out the way you want and you see that the people are confused. And in that case, the behavior that you can manifest is to admit it, to say something like, I can see that what I'm trying to tell you and get across is causing confusion, or you don't understand what it is I'm trying to get to. And that's my difficulty. I don't think I'm communicating it effectively. Allow me to say it in a different way and see if I can get my idea across. And then you do that. And what you're doing in that is you're asking people to give you permission to have another go at it and recognize that you do have something, you're passionate about it, you think it's worthwhile, but you're allowing them to recognize that it was just a communication that you weren't doing effectively and you weren't precise enough. So those are the kind of behaviors that you will see, that you will participate in, that you will help people with to make sure that they get to it. So you can see now how these principles are really starting to interconnect with each other. Around having a really good communication that has the best evidence to support the conclusions that we want to make, so whoever the deciding person is, which we call the steward, can make the best decision that they can based on the collective intelligence of the group. So, as always, we're going to end with an exercise. Now what can you do with all of this? And so a simple exercise is to go back and to look at the acronyms that are being used in the team and see if there's any that are causing confusion and bring that up to them. And the other exercise to go through is that the next time you have to draw a conclusion, to either pause before you draw the conclusion so you can think about what the relationship is between the evidence and the interpretation of that and the conclusions you draw before you say it, or another way of doing that is to, if you're in a position where you're going to have to make a report to prepare for it. So think about some report you're having to make, and actually, here's how they connect. Hover on the evidence you have, the implications of the evidence, and the conclusions you're going to draw. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you again for allowing me to serve you.